Dobry wieczór wszystkim. Przygotowałem dzisiaj dla Was wywiad z Werą Sharav. Ten wywiad już ma około 3 miesięcy, czekał długi czas na przetłumaczenie. Akurat nadarzyła się okazja, bo też Vera Sharav była niedawno w niemieckiej komisji, w niemieckim komitecie korony i dała ciekawy wywiad też, więc pomyślałem, że jest czas, żeby też ten wcześniejszy wywiad wyemitować. Jest to niesamowita postać. Myślę, że nie będę przedstawiał za bardzo dokonań Wery, ale po prostu warto powiedzieć, że jest to osoba, która walczy o prawa pacjentów, zwłaszcza tych, którzy nie potrafią sami o te swoje prawa walczyć, czyli głównie chodzi o osoby z upośledzeniem psychicznym. Nie będę zagadywał, zaczynamy.
When medicine veers away from the Hippocratic oath that promises to respect the individual right, to do no harm to the individual, then you're going to harm the community as well, because the community is a bunch of individuals. There are crossroads in life where you have to make choices. And if you don't, someone who will make the choice for you is not going to make it for your best interest. The idea of just following authority without considering, what if they're wrong? What if it's not in my best interest? I wouldn't want to live under such a regime. I know what it's like. I know what that is. I would not do it again.
Vera, thank you so much for allowing me to be here today and for talking with me on camera. It's truly an honor. Vera is the founder of the Alliance for Human Research Protection and the president, and she has moved mountains to protect research subjects, primarily children, those with mental illness, and minorities. Vera's work has resulted in the suspension of government pesticide experiments on children, federal investigations into children in foster care being used as guinea pigs, the suspension of smallpox vaccine on children, the suspension of psychological experiments on young boys aged 6 to 11, most of them of color in New York City, and dozens of other accomplishments that have directly saved lives. The work that you have done is immeasurable, and the benefit to society is truly eternal. So we thank you for standing in the gap and fighting for the moral and ethical issues that often go unseen if there weren't people like you fighting on our behalf.
Thank you so much.
Vera, would you be willing to share some of your experiences as a child and as an adult that led to your value in safeguarding and protecting informed consent and parental rights?
I was a small child, 3.5 years old, when my family was chased out of our home in Romania, and we were herded into a concentration camp. My father soon died of typhus. And my mother and I were left in a camp that was not a death camp. There were many other kinds of camps, essentially where people were left to starve. But with always the fear of being sent to one of the death camps. That was always in the horizon. I was in the camp for about 2 years. And at that point, they were supposed to essentially liquidate it, as they were going to do with all the camps, and just annihilate everyone. There was a deal made by which orphan children were allowed to be sent out of the camp if they had someone to sign for them. My mother sent me as an orphan, and I knew I was not exactly an orphan, but this was to save my life. I wound up for about a year, going from one family to another, and it's kind of strange, you know, how a child absorbs these kind of traumas. For many years, I didn't really touch it. I didn't allow it to come out in my consciousness because it's so painful. I can't stress how awful it is for a child to be separated from their parents. It's really, really devastating in the sense of, even though I was not mistreated by anyone along the way, but the sense of self-worth goes very, very deeply. So after this year of wandering from one family to the other, it's a long story, I was on my way to my mother's sister in Israel. I had befriended a family on the train to the ships that were to take us from Romania, because I was sent back to Romania from the camp, which was, the camp, by the way, was in Ukraine. On the train, I befriended a family and I got attached to them. One of the things that I learned as this wandering child is to choose, to select grown-ups that I could trust. I was little, and I did not trust to be with my peers, with other children who were bigger and all that, because I knew I would not do well with them. I needed an adult. I wanted adults. When we got to where we were supposed to embark on the boat, 3 boats were to go, and they had lists of who was to go on which boat. I was supposed to go on a boat with the orphan children. The whole boat was going to be with the orphans. But I refused. I refused to be separated from this family that I had become attached to. And this is a very searing memory. There I was. Everyone was already on one of the 3 boats, and I was sitting on my little valise, just crying, screaming. I just was not going to go, no matter what. Of course, in today's milieu, that would have been ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and all sorts of things like that. This was one of the most important lessons that I learned that I would say people should think about. And this is a child, you know. By then I was 6 years old. As we left, and this was from Romania, it was to Istanbul. From there, we then took a train to Israel, which was a very unusual thing at the time. But anyway, during the night, while I was asleep, I was not awake because I was very seasick, so I could not be much on the boat. It was always to go down and go to sleep. A submarine drowned the boat with all the children.
The boat that you were supposed to be on.
That I was supposed to be on, and I knew it. And when they told me, I didn't say anything, but I knew that I saved my own life by being oppositional defiant disorder. That's a lesson that right now is very needed. Adults now are not rebelling against things that are wrong. People are being pushed around, denied normal interaction, and they're just following it like sheep. There's something very wrong. part of what's wrong is the idea of just following authority without considering, what if they're wrong? What if it's not in my best interest? Why? This is very dangerous that we have so many people, good people, people who think that they're doing the right thing community-wise, but they might be devastating both the community, the economy, of course, has been destroyed, and their health as well. Just following without questioning. As I say, this incident, it just encapsulates, I guess, who I am. Why I have been sounding alarms when I recognize that they're alarming. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do, to follow. That's what happened in Germany, essentially. All Germans were not evil, but most of them, the vast majority, simply went along. And of course, yes, it was wartime, and we're always being told about war, and now it's a war on a virus. I mean, that kind of thing should not eliminate basic human rights and basic respect for individuals. It starts, and medicine especially, which is so intertwined, and as it was then. When medicine veers away from the Hippocratic oath, which is an oath that promises to respect the individual right, to do no harm to the individual. If you don't harm the individual, you're not going to harm the community. But if you wipe out the individual's right, their human right, then you're going to harm the community as well, because the community is a bunch of individuals. It's not some other entity.
Yes, it seems that there's been a confusion. People, authority have tried to make it confusing as to whether what's good for me, if that can possibly be good for the whole, or if I should be looking out for the whole before myself. And that's become such a source of confusion for many people during national crisis.
Look, I mean, going back to the sacrifice, the decision that my mother made, I mean, this was a terrible choice that she had to make. And it was to save my life. It had nothing to do with community, but it was a sacrifice that she, as a mother, this is what motherhood is about. Yes, you need to sacrifice for your children.
And the community can only be as strong as the individuals that make it up. Is that what I hear you saying?
Absolutely. Certainly on a moral level, but also on a practical one. If you deny the human individual the right to think and question and assess and make decisions based on their own judgment and experience, then you are creating robots.
And when did you first put together your passion for informed consent and safeguarding these rights with your experience as a 6-year-old girl standing up for yourself?
That came later when I did a lot of research, and because I did want to know how could it happen. One of the things that when I came out of that whole experience, it was the rest of the world went on. Where were they? Where was everybody? Why didn't anybody stop this? I couldn't understand that. That was my moral, judgment. So I did a lot of reading and things, and that's when I realized that one of the worst things that happened, aside from, because the Holocaust is divided, is mainly focused on Jews because they wanted to annihilate the entire Jewish people. So that's that's where that is. But really, it took time for that plan to be acted out on. And the first victims of the Nazi regime were children, disabled children. They were taken from their families. They had organized a whole system whereby schools would identify them. At birth, they were identified, and their names would be sent to the central government. And then they rounded up the children, took them away from their parents. They told the parents that they were going to be given special treatment. And of course, that was a lie. They took them, and it was doctors, medical doctors, who made the selections. They made the selections of which children were going to be used for experiments before they were killed. The experiments included starvation, to see how long a child can subsist on practically no nutrition. And they would record all this very methodically. And they tested the Zyklon B, which was later used in the gas chambers. So it began with the children. It then got expanded to mentally ill adults, and eventually also the nursing homes, the elderly. The Nazis called them worthless eaters. And I shudder that today, under this COVID-19 pandemic, nursing home residents in the United States, in Europe, were the largest percentage of casualties. This did not happen by chance. Yes, people in nursing homes, the elderly with all kinds of ailments, are vulnerable. And everyone was told, because of these vulnerable old people, we must shut down society because we have to protect them. That was an absolute lie. Those people were targeted to die. In New York, our governor and the health commissioner, New York State Health Commissioner, issued an order that older people coming to a hospital should be turned to a nursing home with or without testing, whether they had COVID or not, and disregarding completely that those nursing homes were completely ill-equipped. They had no protective gear. They had no way to separate. These are not, they're not hospitals, but they're also understaffed, under-resourced. I mean, they didn't have masks. They had nothing. So, of course, a very, very high percentage got infected and died. They were not given treatment. This is a crime.
So based on age,
Yes.
the order was that they should, upon admission to the hospital, be transferred to a facility.
Right. They did not want to treat them in the hospital. Right.
And there was no protocols in place to make sure they were receiving the care that they needed.
No. And what happened is, in fact, is both the elderly and staff, the caregivers, they also have a high percentage who wound up dying, because one of the things that really is true with this virus is it depends how much that you are infected. It's not, at first we were told, oh, the doorknobs and all this sort of thing, that was all nonsense. It's really how much of the virus do you come in contact
The
with.
concentration of it.
That's right. And these caregivers, well, they were right there without any help, without any protection. So they both got infected and infected others whom they went and cared for. Because one caregiver would be taking care of a whole lot of them. It's a horror. It's the kind of horror that really, there should be accountability. There should be a real investigation how this happened.
So when you're drawing these parallels between what you've seen in history and what you're seeing now, is it offensive to compare Nazism to what's happening in America today?
What's offensive is what's happening in America today. That the Nazis were savages, we know. That's the history. Some have gone on trial, some have been executed. History has told that story, not fully, but to a great degree. But here, no one is held accountable at all. In fact, Governor Cuomo gave the nursing homes total immunity. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It's unheard of that this should happen today in 2020, and this is called civilized way of dealing with a public health emergency.
So what I hear you saying is it's not too far of a stretch or a leap. It's not extreme to compare what we're seeing with what we've seen in the past.
I think each one needs to evaluate it themselves. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I link it, Nazism. And that's not the point. The point is what was done, what were the policies, what was the rationale. They had a similar rationale. Remember, they wanted to get rid of what they called worthless eaters, okay? Their economy was very bad at the time. This was wartime. Everything was going for the war, and civilians didn't have enough to eat as well. I mean, there were shortages and all that. So this was their way of dealing for the folk. Forget the individual. What I'm suggesting is that when you eliminate the sanctity of the individual person, you are crossing that line. You're no better.
Let's go back in history with Nazism. How were the people convinced to look out for the folk instead of for themselves or their individual loved ones? How did that look in the very beginning?
Under the Nazi regime, and the same thing happened under the Soviet regime and under the Chinese regime, you have a dictatorship that is running the society with fear. Constant fear and surveillance. They used at that time what they could, which today is not comparable at all. Today one can do everything remotely with drones and with all sorts of technologies. But I do want to say one thing, another similar use of technology. Very few people know this, actually. But IBM had a contract with Nazi Germany, and they supplied their punch card technology, which enabled the Nazis to identify and round up European Jewry. That's what surveillance is for. And that's how they were able to actually root out almost every Jew in Europe and send them to camps. That was the IBM contribution to the Holocaust. People had wondered all along, how could it have been so efficient? Because this was industrialized murder. That's how. This is business. This is big business. IBM they had plants in different parts of Europe because they were selling their technology just as Bill Gates sells his technology. I mean, this was a business. And in fact, I've read also recently that in some concentration camps, they actually had the IBM machine with the punch cards to decide which one is to be exterminated under which shift and whatever. Oh yeah, this was run as an industrial business.
So, how did your journey as an activist begin? Protecting informed consent and digging into these issues here in the States.
Well, it began really with tragedy, a different tragedy. My firstborn son developed a mental illness, and I had to deal with the mental health system, which is a terrible place. And this is right here in New York with all the, top hospitals and all that. Again, the psychiatric community, those who are really ill, they are disqualified by the medical profession. So for example, when someone with a mental illness, if they claim, let's say, to be abused or anything that no one believes in, they're disqualified because they're mentally ill. They can't, even if it ever got to that kind of thing where they have to testify, let's say, in court, they would be disqualified because they're mentally ill.
Lack of capacity. And so their voice is totally
silenced.
That's
right. That's right. And so in that sense, you have to do for them. They need an advocate. And one of the tragedies in that whole system is that there was a shift. A business model has taken over completely, which is drug-centered, pharmaceutical drug-centered. And by now it's drug cocktails. It isn't even just one drug. It's lots of drugs. Now, those drugs, every one of them has serious side effects. So that taking the drug for, let's say, depression or whatever, there are trade-offs which the person has no way of making because they're not told, and neither are their parents. Those drugs cause diabetes, okay? They make people suicidal. Now, all those, and the heart tremors and arrhythmias and all that. This is now known, but you see, at the time when the drugs were launched, they didn't admit to any of these adverse effects. It was, these are wonder drugs. This is like penicillin, like the antibiotics. That was a lie, but it was a marketing lie.
Because they knew.
Well, the companies, while testing them, yes, some of these adverse features showed up, but they didn't disclose that. So as a result, my son died of the medication that he was prescribed. The point is that the New York State Department of Mental Health, they tried to make the coroner change his cause of death on the death certificate. Well, he wouldn't. But they went that far. They wanted to hide, to conceal the fact that the drug caused total organ arrest. It killed him. They didn't want that because they have, at the time, they were using that drug as the first line. That was the recommended drug to use.
It was a standard of care.
And that's what it actually did. That, in other words, the risk surrounding the drug was concealed, and that's how things have been with many drugs, most of the psychiatric drugs. It only came out once they were no longer the exclusive patent, the drug, once it wasn't really making as much money, then slowly things came out. But really, the point is, though, that once you realize that this whole medical establishment has been lying, has been a party to a lie, to a very serious lie, and people are dying, and it's not even being counted as being as a result of the drug, I realized I have to look further. Before this happened, actually, because I started to advocate, to look for the right treatments and so forth, someone anonymously sent me an article from the American Journal of Psychiatry in which it describes what happened to 28 veterans at the Bronx VA who were taken off. They were mental patients. They had schizophrenia, but most of them had been living in the community. So in other words, they were in remission. They took them back to the hospital, took them off all medications that they've been on, and they gave them L-Dopa. L-Dopa is a drug that's used for Parkinson's, but L-Dopa is known to cause psychosis. Every one of them who had been in remission, essentially, had a relapse, a psychotic relapse. And this was a government-sponsored experiment. Now, when I read it, the first thing I said, this isn't possible. This isn't in the United States. And these are veterans. And I sent it to 2 psychiatrists that I knew. And I said, am I reading this correctly? Is this what they did? And one of them was a chairman of psychiatry at Long Island Jewish. Now the hospital has changed. And he said, yes. And that was, okay, this is deliberately causing patients to have psychotic relapse. I mean, what could be more Nazi-like? Because the mentality is the same. They don't feel that these patients are human beings. They used their ability to exploit them and to exploit the Veterans Administration hospital to do this kind of research. So that was the first complaint that I filed with the Federal Oversight Agency. They've changed names, but doesn't matter. And this was all done with the approval of these so-called institutional review boards, which are supposed to be the watchdog within an institution before research on people is done. But it's on paper only. And that was the first. And then I had a whole series of similar and, experiments that were done, many on children as well. But this was during the 90s and 2000, around that time, okay? But things have not gotten better, okay? They've actually gotten worse. Because now mother isn't asked, even when she gives birth, if they should give her baby a tetanus vaccine. And why are babies given tetanus vaccines? It makes absolutely no sense in a medical way. But if you have contracts and business to worry about, then I guess it makes sense. But these babies are being used.
And that's an example of the deviation from the Hippocratic Oath, that
Absolutely.
It's no longer looking at the patient as
That's right.
first do no harm, but there's contracts in place that muddle up.
Yes, exactly.
The judgment.
And especially, it begins in the public health arena. Public health is government. And that was what happened in Nazi Germany. All of medicine wound up being public health. Once you have medicine in partnership with government, there is no individual care. There's the Hippocratic oath goes out the window. And since you have government behind you, the doctor's not responsible for their actions. They're working together with the state. That's when medicine becomes weaponized. And what I've described is weaponized medicine. If you dictate what medicine is given to your child and you don't have a say, that invites all kinds of really serious violations of your child and your role. You know, children are sometimes taken away from their parents if the parent refuses. For example, with psychiatric drugs, ADHD, if you don't agree to give your child, they've taken children away. That's called Child Protective Services. Who are they protecting? Certainly not the children. There are many areas now where there's been a complete incursion into private families. Who is to say, where is the evidence that government knows best for what's for your child? There is no such thing. It's only if you give in and you obey, then you're not meeting your responsibility as a child. Really, parents have to be willing to go to battle to protect their children.
And that's what we're seeing today, these legislative trends that are infantilizing adult men and women and saying the state knows best for you and for your child.
Right.
And so we're expected as parents to willingly give up our parental rights and our healthcare rights and give them to the state and into state mandates.
That's right.
And I'll ask you a hard question, admittedly, because we're all journeying this together. But how do parents go to bat?
They have to organize. They have to organize. It doesn't take the entire population to rise up. It's enough if a certain number does. Now, there is more awareness. There is more combativeness in Europe. In fact, in Germany. Germany has had some very, very large rallies. I mean, I'm talking 50,000 rallies against mandatory vaccination. You don't read about it in the media. Okay, because the media is very much part of the business empire that's ruling that. Vaccines are an empire, and now they really want to do a vaccine globally. Do you know what kind of a market that is? More than 7 billion people for a vaccine. Can you even count the kind of profits no matter what they charge for it?
Yes.
That's what their goal is. That's the whole allure of this COVID-19 vaccine. It's that market.
And we've seen estimates recently that the vaccine industry is currently worth an estimated $60 billion annually. And then we've also seen estimates with the COVID vaccine that it could be worth over $300 billion annually because it's global.
Bill Gates said on camera recently, since he invested in 7 factories for a vaccine that's not yet developed, so he was asked, well, isn't that a lot of waste of money? And he said, what's a few $1 billion when we're talking trillions? Yes, that's what it's about. It's trillions.
Witam ponownie. Chciałbym dodać do tego, co powiedziała Wera, że a propos gubernatora Kumo, decyzje gubernatora nie tylko dotyczyły osób z domów opieki, z domów starców, ale także osób upośledzonych i obecnie stawiane są zarzuty wobec gubernatora opiewających gdzieś na około 15 000 zgonów. I tak przez przypadek się pojawiła wokół niego afera rozporkowa, która prawdopodobnie ma to wszystko przykryć. To tak gwoli dopełnienia. I druga rzecz ciekawa, taka trochę straszna, ale IBM wygrał w Niemczech przetarg na dostarczenie, to takie właśnie konsorcjum kierowane przez IBM wygrało przetarg na dostarczenie tak zwanych paszportów szczepionkowych, także historia się powtarza. Myślę, że na dzisiaj tyle. Trochę tak zrobiliśmy taki partyzancki tutaj materiał i trochę tak działamy po partyzancku. Myślę, że będzie trochę takich działań więcej, bo spróbujemy uderzyć trochę szerszą flanką. Do zobaczenia, trzymajcie się ciepło.